In the kit for our final block, you have 5 pieces of fabric. The yellow, which is going to be the sunflower petals, the brown, which is the sunflower center, this green piece, which is cut on the bias, and that's going to be the sunflower's stems and leaves, and there are 2 pieces of background fabric. Before we can start doing the applique on this block, we actually have to sew some pieces together. So this shorter background piece needs to be cut down to 6.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and this piece needs to be cut down to 4.5 inches by 12.5 inches. The long narrow background strip gets sewn to the left edge of our house unit, and then one of our 8-unit flying geese gets sewn to the top of the unit that's closer to square. If you've been playing along with me in previous months, then you already have this unit together. If you haven't, then you will need to put it together. It's the sawtooth star. There's 2 of the filler rectangles from the very first month, and then our checkerboard. That unit gets sewn to the right side of the background in the flying geese unit. Once this unit was together, I sewed it to the top of the house block, and then after I'd pressed it, I stay stitched around the outside edge. If stay stitching is a term you're unfamiliar with, all it is your regular length stitch, and you're stitching inside the seam allowance. So in this case, our seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch, so I stitched it roughly 1/8 of an inch from the edge. What stay stitching does for you is it helps prevent stretching, and it's also going to control any fraying while we're handling this. I thought I'd show you one more method of applique. You are certainly welcome to use any of the ones we've already done. This is the block, or the applique, that's going to fit into our background pieces we added on here. I'm going to do back basting, and for back basting, you'll be tracing from the wrong side of your pattern, so it will need to go on a light box or a window. And you'll be tracing it to the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to do it on a light table. I'm not going to try to film it because I'll get glare back from the light on the light table. But I wanted to show you what needs to line up if you choose to do it that way. This dotted or dashed line here is going to need to line up with the seam allowance here. So I'll trace it and then bring it back and show you what it looks like. So I have marked my sunflower on the wrong side of my background fabric, and the next thing I'm going to do is put some pins in. The first piece that's going to go down is the sunflower stem, and I just want the pins in so that when I flip it over, I have a fair idea of where the applique fabric is going to go. So I will just pin all the way around. I did forget to say that the pattern tells you you need to extend the stem about 1 inch beyond where it is. If you've lined up those dashed marks with your seam allowance here, then just run the stem on down to the raw edge. So now I'm going to flip this over, and I can see where my pins are, and that's what I want to cover with the applique fabric. And the piece is plenty big enough. So I can actually move it over a little bit, and remember, this is a bias piece, so it will go around the curves for you. And then I just want to pin the applique fabric, and it's right side up on this side and right side up on the background. So I'll just pin that down to hold it temporarily. Now I'm going to hand baste along my drawn line for the stem. This is a good place to use up old thread that's perhaps rotten or that you really shouldn't be running through your sewing machine. I also like to use a fairly fat needle because it will leave holes that you can kind of see on the front. That's not technically what we're turning to, but it can be helpful. I don't even bother to tie a knot. I just start basting, and I usually like to either start on a straightaway or where I'm going to be able to just have the raw edge and not have to turn it. When I have long straight places, my stitches can be fairly long. If you get into tighter curves or points, like the curves up here on this, you're going to want your basting stitches to be closer together. The only thing you really care about on the thread you're using to baste with is that it's a color that's going to show up on your applique fabric. So I'm going to baste that and I'll show you how that looks. I've basted around my stem. I did run out of thread here. I did not knot off. I just left the tail hanging and started another piece of thread. And here you can see the basting on the front. My next step is to come in and cut a scant 1/4 of an inch away from the basting threads. And when you're basting, you do want to make sure you stay on that line, because your basting on the front is going to be your guide for turning your applique. So now I'm ready to start stitching my applique. I've switched to my straw needle, and I'm just going to start at one end. I pull the basting thread and just turn under the edge to the basting thread. Don't pull a whole bunch at once, and go ahead and stitch. When you get to where you can't stitch anymore, or where it's awkward, then go ahead and pull the next thread. And now I'm going to turn under to that point and stitch. I'm just going to go all the way around the whole piece that way. So it's stitch, pull the basting thread, turn under the seam allowance up to your, so I'm turning it under to there, and when I get up to the curve up here, I will need to clip the curve so it can turn smoothly. So when you're doing tight curves, and it's going to be tighter than this, and I'll show you when I get to the petals, that's when your basting stitches need to be closer together so that you can follow that curve. And if you're stitching well, then on the back you're going to be pretty close to hitting the line. A lot of times you do hit the line, so that's a good check to see how you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch around the stem, and then I'll come back for the next part. I have appliqued down the stem, and I have also put the pins in for my next piece on the sunflower. That's going to be the petals that go behind the center. I will baste it on exactly like I did before, pin it on and baste it on the line. Up here I want the raw edge to extend behind the brown in the center. I will baste it, but I won't be turning that, so just a 1/4 inch or so beyond that line. I usually baste a little bit beyond the line if I'm not turning there, and then trim it so that I have plenty going under the other pieces. I've stitched down my first set of petals. I do want to mention that when you're appliquing out here on my stem, I can have my stitches not super close together, but when we're trying to control tight inside or outside curves or points, you will need your applique stitches to be closer together. Now, this hasn't been pressed yet. Applique always looks better after it's pressed. So I'm ready now to put my brown center in, and I have put the pins in so I know where they're going to go. So I'll just place that over it. I usually do hold it up to the light and look from the back to make sure I have a seam allowance all the way around. That's if you can, because if you have a dark background, you may not be able to see through. So I'm going to go ahead and baste that down and applique it, and then I'll come back and show you. I didn't say it when I put the brown piece down, but if you noticed, I put it so that the curve was on the bias. There's a curve up here, and there's all these little curves too. I will be putting this piece down as well so that the curve is on the bias, so it's there. If your curves are on the bias, it is much easier to get a smooth turn. So I'm going to just baste this down just like we did the other, and then applique it down. As you can see, I have jumped ahead and finished the sunflower. The process is the same throughout. After you've traced the back, then you're going to position your fabric on the front, pin it in place, baste from the wrong side, trim your seam allowance, and then turn your fabric under to the basting stitches and just pull them one at a time as you go. The nice thing about the back basting is it is extremely portable. This block went with me on a road trip. You do not need an iron to do your starch and press. You don't need an iron to to press down freezer paper. You can do it anywhere. I did it in the car. So once this is done, we're ready to put the whole quilt together. So grab your blackbird block from last month, and we're going to add the checkerboard unit that was 16 long to the top of it. Now pull out your half square triangles from month 1 along with the rectangle and square filler blocks, and just pick which ones you want. You will need 1 rectangle, 5 half square triangles, and 1 square. Sew those together, and those will be sewn on top of the blackbird unit. Next, sew your blackbird unit to the top of the house and the sunflower unit. Make a strip from 2 of your filler rectangles from month 1 from this last star block. This is the last fried egg flower and the last daisy. Sew those together, and then they are attached to the bottom of the house unit. The unit with the flag and the beehive is sewn to the left side of the unit with the house and the bird and the sunflower. And then the unit with the birdhouse and the watering can is sewn to the right side of that. And no, we're not quite done because you still have some pieces left. Okay, we're making a strip for the very bottom of the quilt. On the far left is the 2x8 checkerboard unit, then a filler square, and then we have a problem because there's an error in the pattern that I just found. The longest flying geese strips that we made were 8 long, and this one needs to be 10. So I will be including fabric to make 2 more geese and add it on the end of that in the kit for this last month. After that flying geese unit, then we have another rectangle filler unit from the first month, 3 half square triangles, and 1 square also from the last month. This is my fix. I copied the foundation just from our original pattern, and I just cut off 2 sections and pieced 2 more flying geese, and then I will just sew them onto the end of that unit. I forgot to say that those last 2 geese that you are attaching should measure 2.5 inches square. That's with the seam allowance on, so when you trim down, trim it to 2.5. Now, you wouldn't actually have to do the flying geese if you don't want to. That's a 2.5 inch unfinished square, so let me show you some options. You could put another 2.5 inch square in there, just plain fabric, a filler block. Realize it doesn't have to stay in that order. You could play with the order any way you like, because when that 2.5 inch square is in there and all the other pieces, it's going to be long enough no matter which way you sew it together. So if you don't like the plain block, you could put in another half square triangle unit. If you don't like that, you could put in a 4-patch unit. I will give you 4 squares of fabric in this finishing, in this last block, that are big enough to do any one of those options.